Chapter 11 of Sex Life of the Gods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomko. Sex Life of the Gods by Michael KNERR. Chapter 11. The ship came to rest upon a flat, ochre-colored plain beside a brilliant white city encased in thick, heavy walls. There was a dull pain in his head and fire in his leg, but he was alive. He lay limply upon the bed while First Spacer Narvi plied him with honey wine to dull the pain. He grinned, studying the blond giant's warm, friendly face. He was among friends. The tall, yellow-eyed Thistians had failed to kill him, and Narvi had whisked him away into the violet sky. "Thought we'd lost you, Lors," Narvi grinned. "You almost did," he replied, choking on the Thista honey wine. "Haven't you anything else, something from Darkan?" "Sorry, friend," Narvi grinned, "but you can be glad to get this. The 36th Command has been drinking up even this stuff. I'll see you later. In the hospital." "All right, Narvi." The big man started away, but Lors stopped him by grabbing his blue sleeve. "Narvi?" "Yes." "Thanks. Thanks a lot." First Spacer Narvi punched him playfully on the arm and left the compartment. The medical men came in then, hooking the anti-gravity capsules to the bed and setting them into motion. The cot-like stretcher lifted and the men towed him out to the freight elevator. As they stowed him into the ambulance, he could see Narvi's staff car skimming toward the commandant's building to make out his report. No doubt Commander Imry would be coming to see him later on. Nick groaned. Another dream that was beginning to clear things up a little. "He's coming around." The words were not English, but Nick understood them. The big blonde cursed softly. "Speak English, Thesa. Someone might hear you." "There hasn't been any more around this farm in months," Thesa replied, lapsing into English. "But if you're getting particular, don't call me Thesa." Nick opened his eyes and blinked at them. It was the two watchdogs, the blonde and his sandy-haired friend. The giant was grinning at him. "Hello," he beamed. "Remember me?" "No. Who in hell are you?" Nick struggled to get out of the chair he'd been dumped in, but was pushed back firmly. "When you didn't report, we went out to find you. The old guy at the gas station covered up for you, so we had to watch Beth's house. Used all kinds of tricks. Lors, why in the blue heaven didn't you make contact?" "You're Narvi!" Nick stared with wide eyes. "You're the man in the dream." "Dream? Say, what's wrong with you, Lors? You refuse to report, you take pot shots at us. That crash was a bad thing. Don't tell me your head—" "Narvi," Thesa put in quickly. "The crash. He was lucky to get out of it alive. Maybe he can't remember what went on. That right, Lors?" Nick stared at them, and foggy pictures swung vaguely into his mind. Galaxies of stars whirled about, silver ships streaking in the sky and tiny points of light whipping across ochre deserts. Men in blue uniforms drilling beneath a violet sky in the heat of a solar wafer splotched above them. It was real. The fears he had had, the crazy alternative that the dreams presented to him, it was all real. "It wasn't a dream," Nick muttered, shaking his head like a punch-drunk fighter. "I really am First Spacer Lors. And I know you. I know you." "Take it easy, boy," Narvi said softly. "You've had a bad time. I might have known you couldn't report to us. Thesa, get some water. He looks as though he's going to pass out." "I'm all right. I'm all right." He looked at Narvi, and the memories, at least a few of them, came fluttering into place. The temporary amnesia slipped aside and the veil began to rise. "You're sure you're all right, Lors?" "Yes, Narvi. Things are beginning to make sense. Tell me about what I'm doing here." Narvi cursed angrily. "Commander Imry, the stupid thistlebug. It's all his fault. All this fouled up thing is his doing. It would have been bad enough even without your ship crashing. That just added to it. Luckily, Imry has been ordered back. Someone back home heard of his idiotic plan, and the government is yelling for his hide." "What plan? I can't—" Thesa came in with a glass of water and handed it to Lors, who sipped at it slowly while the big blonde explained things to him. While Narvi talked, it all began to come into sharp focus in his mind. "After you and I finished campaigning on Darkhan and Thista, we applied for assignment in this galaxy. They wanted to split us up at first," Narvi grinned, "but we got mad, so they left us together and we were shipped here under old Commander Imry. After a couple of years, Terran time, studying on Mars, we became agents on this planet. I got an easy one here with Thesa, but Imry had bigger plans for you. Damn him!" "But why are we spying on these people, Narvi? For war?" "I hope not. The Terrans are getting close to space travel, and you know what that would do to our colonies in this galaxy. They're entering a primitive atomic civilization, and they're like little children playing with weapons. Oh, they're serious enough, but they're so damned careless they're likely to ruin the planet in atomic wars." "Sounds like the ancient history of our own planet," Lors said softly. The memories were coming in faster now. "True. And you know what happened to us. Damn near lost the whole planet. Anyhow, you know the other planets in this galaxy? Well, since Terra has a life form like ours, we could use this place as a link in the supply chain. That is our main purpose. Trade. But these people have a strange attitude. Why, if we would land a ship now, they'd rip us to shreds before you knew it. These people fear what you don't understand, and anything they can't understand they kill. So right now we're sending agents, or spies, down here with instructions to probe about. They're coming along rather well. Getting out of the trees, you might say. But we'll have to keep an eye on them for a while yet." Lors finished the water. "But what has this got to do with Commander Imry and me?" "Apparently I was to take the place of Nick Danson, but why?" "That was Imry. You see, many times our agents are handicapped by the very lives they lead. In order to learn about people, one has to live with them. When our agents do this, they have to get jobs and settle down in one area. Imry picked Danson because he's a footloose artist who paints illustrations for magazines. All he had to do was snatch Danson, work a little plastic surgery on you, and put you in Nick Danson's place. You then would not be confined and could roam all over the planet without being questioned." "That's crazy," Lors told him. "I couldn't take Danson's place for the rest of my life. He was gambling on a hell of a lot." Narvi grinned. "You're a good spacer, Lors. You follow orders even when they're dictated by a madman. When you left the ship you were Danson. You were processed so beautifully that no one could tell the difference. When you cracked up, a blow on the head, or something, must have created a temporary amnesia, and you thought you were Danson. We certainly had a time locating you. Anyhow, you're to go back to the ship as soon as you can. The new commander wants to talk with you." Narvi grinned slyly. "I imagine you'll want to talk to him, too. It's Zark, our old friend from Thista." "Zak? Yes, I remember him." Lors stood up and paced the room in thought. He remembered gray-haired, friendly Zark, but more than that, he remembered Commander Zark's beautiful blonde daughter, Jella. "I remember a lot now, Narvi. It's too bad they didn't send him sooner. Things wouldn't be so messed up." "It's not so bad." "No?" "No. You'll probably be going back to the home planet now." "I can't go back," Lors mused. "I have to stay and see this through. It's personal now." "Personal?" Narvi was clearly puzzled. What can be personal about a spacer and an alien race? He looked at his friend levelly. "I can't leave this planet, Narvi, because of Beth Danson. I'm in love with her." "Love?" Narvi exploded. End of chapter 11. Recording by William Tomko. Of Sex Life of the Gods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomko. Sex Life of the Gods by Michael KNERR. Chapter 12. In the heavy silence that followed, the two men stared at one another. Lors regarded his friend with matter-of-fact calmness, but Narvi's mouth was open in astonishment. The situation wasn't covered in the manual. "Love," Narvi choked finally, "with an alien? You must be joking." "I'm serious." "That blow on the head must have been solid as a rock." Thesa just stared, without speaking. "Beth is a wonderful woman, and I'm in love with her. If the blow on the head did that, well then, I'm glad the ship cracked up." "But Lors, she's an alien. It's like a farmer falling in love with his stock. It's crazy. You couldn't live on this planet the rest of your life, and she couldn't live with you." Lors shrugged. "What about Jella?" Narvi demanded swiftly. He didn't answer him. Memories of the blonde woman with the trim ankles, the slim waist and the large breasts floated back to him, memories of the many evenings they'd shared walking along the sand under the stars. He sat there fingering the thoughts as they rolled past, without feeling anything. He was aware, finally, that Narvi was speaking to him. "Know how you feel, Lors, but forget it. You could never work anything out. Go on back to Jella and forget about this alien. It doesn't matter how wonderful she is. Probably nothing short of killing her husband would gain her for you." Lors smiled thinly. "We can do that too." He paused and looked thoughtful for a moment. "What did Imry do with Danson?" "Nothing. He lives better than most spacers. Since we are minus prisons on starships, Imry installed him in your quarters, under guard of course. Commander Zark hasn't been able to figure out what to do with him yet. That's what he wants to talk to you about." "Have you a scout ship here?" Lors asked. "Certainly. We use them to make reports. The Terrans would pick up the radio waves otherwise." "How about a uniform?" "You can borrow one of Thesa's. You'd never get into one of mine." "Fine. As soon as I'm properly attired, we'll go see Zark." Grinning at Narvi, Lors followed Thesa into the bedroom for the uniform. Later, dressed in the uniform of a first spacer, Lors checked himself in the mirror of the bedroom, making certain that he was properly dressed. Trousers bloused neatly into the black half boots, the yellow stripes perfectly aligned, the cuffs of the tunic fastened at his wrists and throat, the emblems of the Eighth. Terran Command on the collar, the patch of rank on his left shoulder sleeve. Yes, he was all set. Precise. He grinned at Thesa. "Feels good," he said. The sandy-haired spacer handed him the black leather belt containing the auto pistol and the cartridge belt. He buckled it on, feeling the familiar weight drag at his right hip. "Okay?" Thesa asked. Lors nodded. "Thanks for the loan," he said, and went out to where Narvi, already dressed, awaited him. "How's your head?" Narvi asked. "Fine." "Let's go then." They walked wordlessly out to the barn. The blonde snapped on a small light near the scout ship, and Lors went up close to examine it. "Climb in," Narvi invited. "I have to scan the area and make sure no one will see the take off." Lors leaped to the cockpit and opened the plastic dome. He dropped lithely into the seat, his feet moving automatically to the rudder pedals, his hands impatiently fingering the controls. So much was coming back, so many remembrances with each second of time. He was not Nicholas Howard Danson, and he had never been. He was First Spacer Lors of the Eighth Terran Command, and he felt his heart thrill to the knowledge of who he was and where he was. It was slow, this strange process of regaining his mind, but it was coming along. He would soon be whole again, no longer some freak caught in the vortex between two worlds. "Ready?" Narvi asked, slipping into the seat beside him and pulling the cockpit shield into place. "Ready. Where's the starship?" "Bearing 204.5, off planet. We'll be there in no time." The barn door swung open as Narvi started the scout ship, and they moved out into the night, hovering a foot off the barn floor until they were outside. Narvi conned the ship, working the vertic control expertly, and the little craft whistled upward at a gentle speed. The radar screen before them disclosed no aircraft in the area. Narvi grinned at Lors and shoved the speed control forward, working the elevators with his other hand, and the scout ship streaked into the night sky. Home. Lors watched the screen, saw the oblong shape of the mother ship blurp into view, and called out its position to his friend. At once Narvi altered the course, whipping the scout ship onto a collision bearing. When they were close enough, they used their signal and heard it answered. The ship slipped in easily as the port opened in the starship's side. Narvi guided the craft in with tender hands and settled it gently on the floor. A positioner hooked a line to the ship and pulled it quickly into the repair bins. A light winked in the wall. The area was again pressurized. They climbed out and dropped to the floor as a crew of repair men went to work on the ship. Narvi slapped Lors on the arm. "I'm going below for a drink. Join me?" Lors shook his head. "No, thanks. I might be down a bit later, but right now I'd best talk to the commander." "Right. Just don't tell him that you're thinking of jilting his only daughter for an alien, or he'll turn 4 different shades of purple." Lors grinned and watched the big blond stride away to the elevator that would take him down to the bar on the first level. Then he walked off in the opposite direction, heading toward the forward end of the ship where he would find his future father-in-law, Commander Zark. Spacers in the gleaming halls saluted him in the traditional manner, a hand clasped to the hip that held their holstered auto pistol, and it was a good feeling. He had almost forgotten. The commander's guards stopped him outside the door, but when he explained who he was and what he wanted they nodded in unison. One of them pressed a button which opened the door to the vestibule outside the commander's office. Lors stepped inside and the door hummed shut behind him. The vestibule was little more than a box-like room containing a small visi-screen. He pressed the small black button at the base of the dark screen and kept his finger on it while the lines waved. "First Spacer Lors to see the commander," he said, as the rotund face of his future father-in-law waved and blurred into focus. "Come in, Lors, come in." Zark's voice was a bellow of pleasure. The heavy door swung open and Lors stepped into the room to click his heels and slap his right hand against the black holster before the commander's desk. "First Spacer Lors reporting, sir," he said, as Zark got up from the chair and came toward him. "Lors, Lors, my son. How are you?" They grabbed each other by the shoulders and laughed like children. Lors, despite his love for Beth Danson and the trouble that was undoubtedly coming up, was happy as a Terran child at Christmas to see the older man. "Lors, let me look at you. It's been eons since Thista. Jella's fair dying to get her hands on you again." He winked at Lors. "And I imagine you are too." "She's here?" A ray of panic touched him and he hoped that it didn't show. "Not that I know of. Unless a ship came in. The last I heard, she was waiting for a ship to take her off the base on Mars. She swears she'll get you this time, or she's going back home to find an old mush shell gatherer." Lors laughed with Zark, who released him to pull a flask of wine from his desk. As he poured 2 tumblers of the milk-white wine, he winked at the young spacer. "From the home planet," he grinned. "Mallow wine. I'll wager you haven't tasted it in a long time." "Not since Thista," Lors assured him, accepting the tumbler. He held up the glass for a toast. "To you, sir, and your daughter. May she be saved from marrying a mush shell gatherer." Commander Zark chuckled and they drank, the soft mellow taste of the wine lingering fondly in their mouths long after the drink had found its way into their stomachs. "Now then, Lors, tell me what that fool of an Imry did to you." He told the commander everything, watching the older man nod his head from time to time, the stubby fingers of his hands forming a pyramid before his lips as he slumped in his chair. Lors left nothing out, except his love for Beth Danson. He couldn't bring himself to tell about that. When he had finished, Commander Zark's eyes were hot with angry indignation. "I'll see that Imry cannot get a command on a planet with a pure ammonia atmosphere for this trick. I'll see him tortured by Thistians." The old man stopped his tirade as quickly as he had begun it. "You know what this means, Lors?" "I'm afraid to guess." "The wrecked scout ship can be covered up easily enough because of the Terran politics. They always arrange it so that one branch of government has no idea of what the other branches are doing. We'll have some of our men in Washington mumble in their beards about experimental aircraft until everyone is taken from the scene except our people. Then we'll have the ship taken somewhere, ostensibly to be studied, and they'll all forget it. But these Terrans are another matter. If they can get their people to listen to them, we're in trouble." "Perhaps," Lors said softly, "if they were believed, it would speed up our relations with the Terran governments." Zark shook his gray head. "No, they aren't ready yet. They're still in such a fluctuating state that half the population believes in witchcraft and superstition, while the other half understands science and looks toward the future. Besides, Lors, others have tried those same tactics and were not believed. To tell the truth, I'm not quite sure what to do." "We could continue the bluff." The commander's brows lifted. "You mean you continue as our agent down there?" "Yes, sir. The way it worked out, with the crash, it merely supported the story I was to tell Danson's wife. I really did have temporary amnesia. No one knows anything except about the ship. Bryce found Danson's watch at the crash site, but we could work a little mental trick on him and make him forget everything he knows. Couldn't we?" "It would be risky. You never know if that process will work until it is tried. As much as I hate the thought, it would be best to kill both of them and send you back to the Terran woman. After we had tried to bluff out Imry's plan for a month or so, we could arrange an accident for you in which it would appear that you were dead, perhaps utilizing the real Danson for the accident. Does the woman suspect anything?" "I don't think so," Lors told him. "She seems too happy in having me back, at the moment." Zark smiled at him and clamped a hand to his shoulder. "You're tired, my boy. Get some rest, and we'll talk about this thing later. You can use First Spacer Thesa's quarters. Danson is in yours." "And Bryce?" "Unconscious, in the hospital. The shock of what took place down there has him recalling every old wives' tale about witches that he has ever heard." "All right, sir," Lors said, smiling. "I'll get to my quarters then. Thank you." "I'll send Jella to you if she comes in." "Thank you," Lors said, but felt shaken at the thought. End of chapter 12. Recording by William Tomko. Chapter 13 of Sex Life of the Gods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomko. Sex Life of the Gods by KNERR. Chapter 13. Outside in the corridor, Lors nodded to the guards and began walking toward Thesa's quarters. In his mind, now that he again had a whole mind, was the feeling of being trapped, the feeling of being caught in a mesh-like web that was about to strangle him. Perhaps they could patch things up on Terra, but the two Terrans would have to die, or at least one, merely to gain him another month or two with Beth. Was it worth it? In the long run, was it practical? Perhaps he didn't really love the Terran woman. Maybe it was just infatuation, or gratitude, or even the result of long abstinence. If that was the case, it would be brutal for them to kill the one man who could make her happy. Then, on the other hand, suppose his love was genuine. If he really loved her, the coming accident which he was to stage would never come to pass. He knew himself too well to believe that. He would take Beth and run, get away into another country, change his name, his features. He smiled to himself and remembered his training on Mars, and the ability of the spaceman to reach out with a long arm to stop anything. Anything. "We are the gods," he remembered. "We are the gods who move with lightning and speak in thunder. The Terrans are like so many cows that need a watchful eye upon them at all times." Gods. Yes, in a manner of speaking, he decided that they were gods. But what did the book say about one of the minor gods being caught up in a crazy thing like this? It had never happened before. Without actually realizing it, he found himself standing at the door to his own quarters. A single guard, armed with an auto rifle, stopped him when he approached the door. "I'm sorry, sir. the spacer said. "You cannot enter here." Danson was on the other side, he knew. Nicholas Danson, the artist, the man with whom he had traded places. Suddenly he wanted to speak with the man, find out about him. All at once Danson was not just another Terran, he was a man with feelings, emotion. "I'm First Spacer Lors," he heard his voice rumble with authority. "I'd like to speak with the Terran." The guard stiffened. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know who you were." "You will open the door, Spacer?" "Yes, sir. But you'd best leave your side arm with me." Lors nodded and pulled his auto pistol from the black leather holster and handed it to the guard, who stuffed it into his belt. He reached back and unlocked the door. As it swung open, Lors stepped inside. The room was not large. It couldn't be very big on a starship, but it was serviceable. There was a dresser and locker for uniforms, as well as a visi screen, a couch, and a small bed. The Terran was lying on the bed, reading. Lors smiled at him. They could have been twins of the same mother, were it not for the fact that Terran's disposition was different. He hadn't shaved in a few days, and his black hair was tangled. Even the fatigue uniform he wore was rumpled badly. "Hello, Danson," Lors said, in English, and to his acute surprise the Terran answered in Lors's tongue. "This mortal bids welcome to the great god Lors," Danson said, with a faint smirk. "You speak my language?" Lors asked, puzzled. "Why not? You speak mine." "When they checked my brain they found that I had a rather high I.Q. Besides, I've read all your reading material and decided that you have lousy taste, so I decided to learn the language and try to make conversation with my watchdogs." "You are comfortable?" Danson nodded. "Wonderful. First rate. Now that I know the language, I'm going to get a deck of cards and teach my jailers how to play draw poker. Then I'm going to win this starship and take it to Washington for analysis." "I didn't come here to jest." Danson lit a cigarette and smiled thinly. "Why did you come here?" "To see you. Are you well taken care of?" "Certainly. They've hooked up my pint-sized TV set so that I can look at the earth. I've been to the lunar base. Terrific real estate. A rock pile. Elaborate, but still a rock pile. I eat very well. I sleep occasionally, except that I cannot get used to the total darkness. And I have minor grievances, like I want to get the hell out of here." He stood up suddenly and glared at Lors. "Am I happy? Am I content? Hell, yes. I'm so goddamn content I'm going stir crazy from it. I'm sick of the whole damned mess, First Spacer Lors. Plain downright sick and—" "Take it easy, Danson." "Shut up! Shut your damned mouth, because I'm not finished. Tell me, God, have you ever been confined to a pint-sized prison? You ever had your brain picked clean by a flock of intellectual buzzards? You ever sat in a room with the walls closing in on you, listening to a couple of blue uniformed knotheads stand outside your door, talking a babble of language that sounded like Chinese, and not be able to speak to them? Not be able to take a piss because you don't know how to find the toilet and don't know how to ask where it is? Well, I have, and I'm up to my ears with this whole bit. I lie here every night and dream about taking this so-called starship and ramming it up your ass, plate by plate." Danson broke off suddenly, unable to continue his wild tirade. He sat there on the edge of the bunk, his face a livid white, with a cigarette dangling from his lips. His left eye closed against the bite of the smoke, and his jaws knotted as he stared at the wall. "All finished?" Lors demanded quietly. Danson grunted. Yeah, Ace, I'm all finished. In a way, I'm sorry, but it felt good. I've wanted to get all that off my chest for a long time." "I can see your position, Danson," Lors told him. "I know what you've been through, but I can't do anything about it. I follow orders." Danson grinned. "Who are you trying to kid, pal? You got Commander Zark's daughter eating out of the palm of your hand. Hell, I'll bet you pull more strings around this ship than a puppeteer." "I've underestimated you, Danson," Lors told him in a soft voice. "You have an interesting mind. Quite a grasp." Danson snorted again. "You guys aren't the sharpest people in the world. I will give you a bit of advice for free. You better either return me to Earth or kill me. In another 13 months I'll figure out a way to blow this hulk into a million pieces." "I doubt that," Lors mused. "Go ahead and doubt it, but you better keep the powder magazine under double guard. And while you're at it, you better have the boys be careful of what they say around me, since I know the lingo." "How many spacers have you talked to?" Lors asked. "How many of them know how intelligent you are?" Danson shrugged. "Why?" "Just wondered." Nick Danson looked at him narrowly. "You have something on your mind, Lors?" "Maybe. Right now I'll keep it to myself. Until then, keep your mouth shut about how smart you are. A weapon, Nick, is only useful when the enemy doesn't know how well it will work. When they know, a counter weapon can be made." Lors moved to the door. "I'll be back, probably," he said, and went out into the corridor, leaving the Terran to ponder on what he had said. The guard snapped to attention, then handed Lors his auto pistol. The first spacer slipped it into the holster and snapped the flap. Then he walked rapidly toward First Spacer Thesa's quarters, with the germ of an idea filtering and dancing through his mind. It wasn't a complete idea, but it certainly was a wild one. The chances of its working were about 1,000 to 1. But if it did, things might work out. He hoped so. He reached the door of Thesa's quarters and jerked it open. His fingers fumbled for the button inside the door that would switch on the lighted walls. When he found it, he closed the door and flicked on the lights. He stared at the inside of the room in amazement. She was lying on the bed, with her golden hair falling about her shoulders like a waterfall of sunlight, and her lips pulled back over white teeth to smile at him. But he was stunned, frozen to the spot. "Jella!" he whispered, in shock. End of chapter 13. Recording by William Tomko.
Of Sex Life of the Gods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Sex Life of the Gods by Michael KNERR. Chapter 14. For a moment she didn't move, and in the silence he allowed his eyes to finger her. Beneath the blonde tumble of hair her blue eyes watched him, her lips toying with a bemused smile. She wore the odd toga-like dress that had recently become popular among the women on the home planet. It was a white color, trimmed in a pale blue that went well with her hair, but Lors hardly noticed it. His eyes were fixed upon the twin lift of her breasts as they fought against the material. She swung her long, curved legs to the floor. A momentary flash of creamy flesh showed at her thighs, and stood up. She came to him on slippered feet, whispering against the floor, and stopped before him, her breasts faintly brushing the material of his tunic. "I thought I'd never get here, darling." Her voice was soft and warm. Sex, love, and desire hung in her words. The emotion dripped from her voice the way water falls from the roof of a cave, giving her tone a throaty huskiness that started the blood racing in his veins. Yet she held herself back, restrained her urge to fling herself into his arms. It was a game with her, one she had always played. "Did you miss me?" she asked. He nodded, unable to trust his voice. It would crack, he knew it would. He would be able to say nothing beyond a mere croak. Too much was happening, too damn fast. It was almost impossible to keep up with it all. "Well," she mused, "I realized you're stunned to see me, but you ought to kiss me, at least that." He reached out his hands slowly, feeling the tremble begin in his fingers as he closed them over the softness of her upper arms. A drum began pounding in his temples as he touched her. A flash flood ripped through his veins, and his stomach churned like a storm. He brought his mouth down slowly against hers, and felt her lithe body flatten up against him, the way a candle melts against a sheet of hot metal. Her mouth was a pliant sweetness that shoved all his thoughts of terror into the back of his mind. Her body trembled against the lean hardness of his in a shiver of passion. The very touch of her tongue against his lips beat aside all the problems that swirled about his muddled mind, and awakened the desire and need that had laid dormant within him all this time. "Darling," she breathed, when he had pulled his mouth from hers. "Oh, Lors, shh." There was no need for talking, no sense in it at all. Her body mashed up against him, and he allowed his hands to smooth down over the material of her dress, along the curve of her spine to the twin globes of her buttocks. Her mouth lifted to his again, eager, demanding, while her fingers dug through his tunic and into his flesh with a sharp need that thrilled him. Her hand reached behind him, her fingers finding the light button, and suddenly the room was sheathed in the soft cloak of darkness. Only the tiny nightlight gleamed like a small yellow eye in the center of the ceiling. She spoke to him without removing her lips, her breath hot and demanding against his mouth. "I don't want to wait any longer, darling," she panted. "Not another minute." His arms slid around her, lifting her at the shoulders and the thighs to carry her to the bed, but she twisted away from him, whirling off into a darkened corner of the room where the yellow light could not touch. He could hear the sigh of the toga-like robe as she whipped it away from her soft flesh. Then she stood there before him, framed in the alluring gold of the circle of light. Lors felt his breath suck inward at the sight of her, standing there, nude. She was even more beautiful than he had remembered, and he felt shaken to the very roots of his being. The smooth curve of her shoulders glowed in the light, and her face was kissed by shadows. The arching lift of her breasts and the impassioned nipples threw a wash of dark shadow downward over the flat of her stomach and the lithe curve of her thighs. With the light covering the beauty of her face, Jella lost her identity. She was woman, period. Any and all, from time immemorial or immoral, perhaps. She was somehow standing there, a composite of every woman who had ever drawn a breath. She was the best of woman, the choicest parts of all women since the dawn of time, suddenly thrown together in a high-breasted, slim-waisted creation that was being offered to him, only to him. And Lors? It moved in him, churned through his guts like a forest fire. He was man, all men glaring with the red eyes of passion at all women. He, too, in the wash of lust that had swept over him, lost his identity, and he didn't give a damn. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except that she was waiting. His fingers ripped away his clothing, and he was at her side in no time at all, his arms sliding about the pliant warmth of her flesh to clasp her to him, to take her, to love her with a fever that was equal to the challenge she presented. She made a small sound, and he hushed it with his mouth, planting his lips roughly against hers while he lowered her to the bed. He hurt her, but she didn't try to get away. It was the kind of hurt she had waited for, that they both had yearned for all the long months that had kept them apart. His hands closed over hers, smoothing the tender flesh and feeling the life beneath his palm. She moaned, tearing the sound from the very depths of her, as his hands smoothed the satiny texture of her thighs, his fingers working against her flesh. He felt the nails of her hands digging into his shoulders, but he paid no attention to it. Nothing mattered now. Nothing except the warmth of their love and the expenditure of the raging passions that threatened to engulf them both. They laid there for a long time, basking in the heat of their love, and he knew. Finally he knew that it all would not work. There could be nothing between him and the Terran woman. It was impossible. She could not live in his worlds, nor could he live in hers. Jella was his world, and the past was merely an emotional thing, a moth and the flame. Yet somehow he did love Beth. Somehow her and her life was important to him. Her happiness was something that he had to assure, had to guarantee for her. He had to work out a plan that would solve everything and return the whole business to a state of normalcy. It would be difficult, if not impossible, and he knew that Zark would never listen to him, never allow him to carry it out. But he had to do it. There would be all kinds of risks, and if he failed in the thing, he might have to pay with his life. If he managed to accomplish it, he would get nothing as a reward except perhaps the hand of the commander's daughter. That wasn't such a bad reward, though. He kissed her, and the fires began to burn again. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of Sex Life of the Gods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chuck Williamson. Sex Life of the Gods by Michael KNERR. Chapter 15. Lors finished dressing himself, buckling the black belt about his waist. Then he looked down at the still form of Zark's daughter, Jella, golden in the light of the overhead bulb. She slept like a baby. He blew a kiss to her and let his breath out in a rush. "If everything goes right," he whispered, "I'll be back here before you know I'm gone. If not—" He let it hang there and checked the loads in the auto pistol. Then he went out into the bright light of the corridor. The guard merely accepted his auto pistol when he stopped at the door to Danson's prison. Lors gave it to him, and the spacer opened the door. Nick Danson rubbed the beard on his face and grinned at him. Forget something, First Spacer?" he asked. When the door closed, Lors said, "Shut up." Danson blinked. "Sit down." Danson sat. "How badly do you want to get off this ship, Danson?" "How badly do you want to make commander?" Danson countered and lit a cigarette. "You willing to risk your life?" "Why not? It isn't worth a hell of a lot anyhow." Lors reached into Danson's shirt pocket, found the pack of cigarettes, and filched one. Nick touched a match to it, and Lors dragged the smoke into his lungs. He could see the Terran regarding him suspiciously. "What's the play, First Spacer?" Danson asked. "You're dead, Nick," Lors said softly, "if you stay on this ship. That can be either literally or figuratively speaking. I don't know. It all depends on Zark's plan for you." Nick snorted. "Hell, Lors, it can't be any worse than whatever Emery has cooked up for me." "It'll be better. That I can assure you. Zark is a just man, but he hasn't much feeling for Terrans." "Yeah, I know. The God theory." Lors nodded. "Well, look, First Spacer," Danson said, snubbing out his cigarette. "Your concerns for my welfare touches me deeply, but I don't get it. How come?" Lors grinned. "I've been asking myself that same question, and while I can get answers that make sense to me, I sincerely doubt if they'd make sense to you. Why don't we just say I like you?" "That's rich, but I'll buy it. All I've got to lose is my chains." "And my memory." "Come again?" Lors sucked on the cigarette. "You can't talk about this thing to anyone except your wife." "Who'd believe me anyhow?" It's bigger than that, Danson. If you talk to anyone, I'll kill you." "You don't make sense. Why not kill me now?" Lore sighed. "Look, Commander Emery made a boo-boo, to use one of your terms, and I got caught in the middle. This whole operation is fouled up because of what he did. If we don't try to put things back, it's going to be in a real tough light. For the first time in history, Terra is in possession of a scout ship, even though it is wrecked. Not only that, but they know it. They're hot on the trail of us, and if enough Terrans get wise to us, we'll be in trouble. You've read my diaries and journals. You know what it's like up here. My planet needs Earth as a trade base. And if you people ever wake up as a race, we'll be able to help each other a hell of a lot. Maybe that's why I want to take you back to your wife. Is that good enough for you?" Danson nodded. "I guess so. I know enough about this situation to tell that you're either on the level, or you're a damned convincing liar. What's the plot?" "The plot, as you put it, is to get you and Bryce back to Earth." "Bryce? Nolan Bryce? He's here?" Lors nodded. "Bryce found your watch where my scout ship cracked up, and guessed who I was before I did. I was hiding up at your cabin, trying to figure things out, when he decided to put a bullet into me. Both Beth and I thought I was you, and she was trying to help me figure out what I'd been doing for 13 months. Bryce came in shooting, and my people kidnapped him. Great. In any event, I think I can get Bryce to the scout ship. I'm going to rely upon you to spring yourself out of here and get down to the hangar. You'll pass for me easily. Okay?" "How do I get past the guard?" "I'll fix it, if I can. If I can't, I'll be back." "Okay, Buck Rogers. It's your show." Lors grinned at him. "Keep your fingers crossed," he said, and went out. "I won't do it," Narvi said flatly. He lifted his glass and took a large swallow of the drink to punctuate the sentence. "You've got to," Lors insisted. "You know as well as I do. It's the only way to straighten things out." "You talked to Zark?" "How can I tell him about it? What am I supposed to do? Tell him that I love a Terran and want to make her happy? Thunder and lightning! What's so important about Bryce and Danson? They're only Terrans. This woman you're so silly about will find someone else. Lors, by gods, if you take those two back, they'll talk to everyone they get their hands on." "No, they won't. Not Danson. Narvi, that's the beauty of this whole plot. Danson understands that our people simply want to begin trade negotiations with Terra. He's learned to speak and read our language, and he knows how badly we want to trade with his people. He'll help us." "What about Bryce?" Narvi snorted. "Bryce can be handled by Danson. If that doesn't work, we can threaten to do all sorts of things to him." "And you want me to take the guard's place outside Danson's quarters and give you time to steal a scout ship?" "Yes." Narvi cast his blue eyes toward the ceiling and groaned aloud. "If I keep doing these goofy things for you, I'll never make commander. I won't even make vice commander." Lors smiled. "Don't worry about it. If things work out, you'll have had a hand in opening up a new planet for our trade rockets." Narvi sighed. "All right, I'll do it. Although I should have my head examined by the ship's doctors." Lors grinned at him and finished the last of his drink. "It'll work out, Narvi, and you'll probably get a medal." "A prison cell, likely," Narvi snorted. "On Thista." Lors slapped him lightly on the arm and left the ship's wardrobe. He had a lot to do, and damned little time to do it in. End of chapter 15.
Scene of Sex Life of the Gods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sex Life of the Gods by Michael KNERR. Chapter 16. Lors left the wardroom and walked along the hollow, brightly lighted corridors toward the hospital where Detective Nolan Brice was being kept a prisoner. He would be the tough one of the two, because his mental roots were still very close to the witchcraft-believing parents who had given him birth. Brice was a Pennsylvanian. He was fairly intelligent, but like all Pennsylvanians, he had an unconscious closeness with tradition. He was of the type who would stoutly deny he was superstitious, yet he would refuse to walk under a ladder. How would he react to Lors's proposal? Would he, with typical Dutch stubbornness, tell him to go to hell, or would he cooperate? It was a difficult thing to predict. Lors shoved the door to the hospital open and grinned at the spacer behind the desk. "You've a Terran here?" he asked. The spacer nodded and laid down the sheets of paper he had been ruffling as Lors came in. "Yes, sir, we have one. He's in the care of Dr. Zuloe." "What are they doing to him?" "I'm not sure, sir. I understand he was in a great state of shock when he arrived. I would imagine they're giving him rehabilitative treatment." Lors grinned again. Apparently the method by which they had snatched the detective had completely unnerved him. "I'd like to see him," he told the spacer. "Where can I find Dr. Zuloe?" "I'm sorry, sir. Only authorized personnel will be allowed to interrogate him." "I'm authorized, I believe. I captured him. I'm Lors." The young spacer flushed. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know who you were." He pointed to the door behind him. "You may go through there, straight down the corridor until you reach the fourth ward." "Dr. Zuloe will be there?" "I think so. Thank you." Lors shoved the door open and walked down the long hall toward the fourth ward, not quite sure in his mind how he could spring the Terran from the hospital and get him down to where the scout ships were hangared. But it had to be done. If he failed, and they all ended up dead or thrown into the penal colonies on Thista, the trade program with Terra would be set back at least 50 years. All the ground they had gained, all the knowledge and plans they had formulated, would be useless. They would have to start from scratch. The wrecked scout ship could be covered up, but the loss of Detective Lieutenant Brice and Nicholas Danson would not go unnoticed, especially when Beth Danson spilled her story about the strange events that had gone on at the cabin. Of course, Terra would never be able to corroborate what she had experienced. Yet they were on the verge of space travel, and they were a warlike race. They could cause all sorts of unnecessary trouble in space. It had to work. He had to get both of them back to the planet, even if it meant stopping a slug from an auto rifle to do it. He reached the door of the fourth ward and went in to look for Dr. Zuloe. The man wasn't hard to find. He was the only person in the small anteroom. "What can I do for you, First Spacer?" he asked. "I'm Dr. Zuloe." "I'm Lors." For a minute they stared at each other. The doctor was a middle-aged man with a weathered skin stretched over a rather aquiline set of features. His small bird-like eyes were piercing in their study of Lors's face. He smiled thinly and ran a hand through graying hair. "Lors, huh? You're the one who went down there?" "I was in the accident. In a sense, I suppose I'm to blame for having brought Brice up here." "You know him?" Dr. Zuloe's eyes narrowed visibly. "Yes, at least I think I know him better than you people do." "Then perhaps you can help us with him. When he arrived here he was in a state of acute shock in which he was almost violent. He kept screaming about witchcraft and all sorts of Terran nonsense. We gave him as much treatment as we could, under the circumstances, and he stopped acting like a wild man." "How is he now?" "Numb. He's sitting on his bed in a special room, and staring at the wall." "He isn't out of his mind, is he?" "I don't think so, but he has had a tremendous strain and shock. It'll take a while. He isn't of the same structure as the other one." Lors sighed wearily. "I'll see what I can do with him. Commander Zark has plans for him." "Another switch?" The doctor made no attempt to cover his disgust over the idea. "An accident, I believe." "From bad to worse, huh?" Lors didn't answer him. He merely made a motion with his hand for the doctor to show him where the Terran was being kept. Dr. Zullo nodded and pointed toward a door at the far end of the ward. A blue uniformed spacer stood guard before the door. He clicked his heels as Lors approached. "I want to see the Terran spacer," Lors said briskly. The spacer nodded and opened the door. Lors stepped inside and listened to the lock click into place behind him. Nolan Brice was seated on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, but Lors did not believe that he was in a state of shock. He had the knotted jaw of a man who is firmly determined to betray nothing to his captors. He sat there, with his fingers laced together, hanging between his knees, his clothing rumpled and hanging loose from his broad frame. "Nolan?" Brice swung his eyes to the first spacer, the muscles of his jaws working. "I'll kill you," he said, with a horrible softness in his voice. "Nolan, listen. I'm here to help you." "You've done a lot of helping, spaceman. I know what you want. Earth." "Don't be silly. I want to help you and Danson get back home." "I don't need you." "Shut up and listen. I'm risking my neck coming in here to help you, so you damn well better follow orders. In a minute I'm going to call that guard in here, and we're going to borrow his uniform. Then we'll head for a scout ship and get you to hell back to Terra. Will that suit you?" "This is some kind of trick." "Do you want to go or stay here?" Lors demanded coldly. "I don't have time to lecture you. I'll leave that up to your friend Danson." "Play it your way, spaceman," Brice said tightly. "Okay." Lors stood up and spoke through the door to the guard, pulling his auto pistol from the holster. "Come in here, spacer." The guard shoved the door open and came in. "What is it, first spacer?" "Him." The guard swung to look at Brice, and as his head turned, Lors brought the butt of the pistol down hard. The guard grunted and dropped heavily to the floor, his auto rifle falling with a loud thud. By now, if everything was working out right, Danson should be on his way to the scout ship hangar. Lors looked at Brice. "Come on, Nolan. Get into these clothes." Between the two of them, the stripping of the guard went fast. In a few minutes, Brice was wearing the spacer's blue uniform, and he was buckling the black cartridge belt about his waist. He gripped the auto rifle in his hands eagerly and looked at Lors. "Hand me his helmet," he said. Lors picked it up and straightened to hand it to the Terran. Lors saw the punch coming, but surprise prevented him from making any move in his defense. Nolan Brice's fist smashed into the side of his face with stunning shock, and he flew backwards onto the bed. "Thanks," he heard Brice snarl. Lors rolled off the bed and onto the floor, the force of the punch making his head reel. He heard the door to the room close, and the sound of Brice's running feet outside as he staggered to his feet. "You damned fool," he thought. "You can't get off this ship alone." He started running after the Terran, drawing his pistol as he ran. End of Chapter 16. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. of Sex Life of the Gods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sex Life of the Gods by Michael KNERR. Chapter 17. Lors dashed down the hallway into the main corridor, passing the limp body of the doctor and the young spacer who had been on duty at the desk. Apparently, Bryce had come into the place fast, swinging the auto rifle like it was a club. Both of the men were unconscious, but there was no blood in sight. Crazy fool, Lors said aloud, and slammed the door as he dashed into the corridor. Bryce was running blindly. "Bryce, stop!" Lors fired the auto pistol over the fleeing man's head. Bryce stopped and whirled, dropping to one knee to bring up the rifle he carried. He snapped off a fast burst, and Lors dived across the polished corridor to hug the wall. He landed, rolling, his pistol zeroed on the Terran, but he couldn't bring himself to shoot. Nolan Bryce, however, had no scruples about shooting at Lors. He fired continually, cursing as the bullets missed. Beyond the Terran, Lors could see four other spacers running down the hall toward Bryce. One of them fired. Bryce whirled, spotted them, and brought up his rifle. The gunfire in the emptiness of the hall sounded like a machine gun being fired in a cave. Lors saw a spacer slam backwards, rolling crazily from the impact of the bullet that Bryce had triggered. The Terran was hunched over in a crouch, like an old gunfighter, shooting from the hip. Suddenly he jerked to his feet, spun crazily in two directions at once, and fell flopping to the floor. The auto rifle clattered as he let it fall. Lors came slowly to his feet and shoved his gun back into its holster. Then he walked over to where Bryce was staring at the ceiling through unseeing eyes. It was a damned shame, but he had brought it on himself. One of the spacers looked at him. "Are you all right, sir?" Lors nodded. "Is he a spacer?" one of them asked, looking at the uniform. "An escaped Terran," Lors said. Then he remembered that Danson was probably down at the hangar. "Don't jettison this body until I give you the orders. Put it in quick freeze." "Yes, sir," the spacer said. But Lors was already on his way down the corridor. He could do nothing for Bryce now. Perhaps it had even been a good thing. The shooting would have drawn most of the high-ranking officers toward the end of the ship, leaving a comparatively clear space between him and the hangar. He hoped that the doctor would stay out for a while. As the Terran said, they weren't out of the woods yet. He found a vacant elevator and took it down to the hangar level. As the door whirled open, he raced into the corridor, nearly upsetting a startled spacer with his rush. He had no idea how long it would be until it was discovered that Narvi had let Danson out, but he knew the escape would not remain unnoticed for long. He burst into the repair bin area of the hangar and jerked his head toward the tubes. When a ship came into the side of the mother ship, they entered through a large port which made it easier for the pilot of the scout ship. But to leave the starship, one had to install the smaller craft into one of the many blast tubes on either side of the big hangar. He looked frantically about the area for Danson and spotted the Terran standing unobtrusively near the pilot entry to one of the blast tubes. Nick Danson, garbed in the blue and yellow of a first spacer, was a twin for Lors. He hoped anxiously that none of the repairmen would notice the trick. Lors grabbed the mechanic by the arm. "Spacer, I'm on an urgent mission. Where can I get a ship?" The young spacer looked thoughtful for a moment, then pointed toward a tube on the other side of the hangar. "In that tube, sir." "Thank you." "I'll help you rig it," the spacer said. "Never mind, I'll do it myself. Go about your work." "Yes, sir." The spacer turned away, a puzzled look on his face. Lors motioned to Danson and headed toward the tube door. He could well understand the spacer's bewilderment. While it was possible for the pilot of a scout ship to launch his own craft, it was highly impractical and not normally done. He hoped it didn't arouse their suspicions. He yanked the door open and looked over his shoulder. Danson was almost to him, running hard. Heads turned as the mechanics watched him run. "Hurry!" Danson reached the door, and Lors shoved him into the tube. "Where's Brice?" Danson demanded. Lors slammed the door and whirled the wheel of the spider lock. He didn't answer. He was too concerned with getting the door secured. Through the port in the heavy door, he could see spacers gesturing and pointing at the blast tube. "Where's Brice?" "He's dead." Lors secured the wheel and noticed that a vice commander had come into the hangar area. "Get in the ship, fast." Outside, the hangar workers were milling about like a fleet of bees. Lors turned to Danson and saw him standing beside the ship, his eyes wild with disbelief. "Get in the ship." "Not without Brice." Lors exploded in his native tongue. "Get in that ship, Danson. How long do you think it'll be before they come in the emergency door?" Nick's eyes were wide and violent. "I'm not leaving Nolan up here, God damn it! Get out of my way!" Lors shoved the Terran as he came in and watched him backpedal into the side of the scout ship. Danson muttered a curse and dived at the spaceman. Lors had no choice in the matter. He swung hard, Terran style, in what has come to be known as the 0-1-2. His left fist dug into Nick's stomach, and when he bent with the blow, Lors brought his right fist up from the floor and felt it smash into Danson's face. The Terran slammed backward against the ship, his head striking the metal sides. He crumpled into an unconscious blue mound beside the ship. He wasted no time. Casting a glance at the lifeless panel that was the emergency door at the far end of the blast tube, he grabbed Danson under the arms and hauled him up the short ladder to the cockpit of the ship. If they came through that emergency door, he was finished. He could not push the button in the wall that would open the huge port in the side of the starship. They would die if he did. It would be one thing to free an alien, but to intentionally kill members of his own race would mean disaster. 30 seconds after he pushed the wall button would open the port at the end of the tube and send the void of space rushing into the chamber. Anyone who did not have adequate pressurization would be a fond memory. He stuffed Danson's body into the cockpit seat and buckled the strap about him. Lors left the cockpit canopy open and leaped to the floor of the tube. "How long do I have? A minute? 2? Keep them outside," he pleaded, and dived for the button. "Lors!" The shout echoed hollowly in the tube. He glanced toward the door and saw 3 mechanics inside the tube. Thunder and lightning. 1 second after he had slammed the button, and all the doors would have locked automatically and the port would have opened. Panicked by the sight of them, he whipped out his pistol and fired. In the tube, the weapon sounded like a firecracker going off in a steel drum. The unarmed mechanic stopped dead, whirled, and ducked back through the door. In another 4 seconds, the armed guards would show up. Lors shoved the weapon back into the holster and slammed his hand against the button. It would lock them out now. He had his 30 seconds now. He dived for the ship, dropped into the cockpit, and slammed the canopy forward, twisting the lock into place. His fingers moved over the controls, and the engine whined into life as the port opened before him. He was on his way. He revved the engines impatiently as the big door rolled away and the stars burned in at him. Then he shoved the speed control forward, and the scout ship surged out into the blackness of space. His feet kicked at the pedals, and his hands worked the stick. The scout ship rolled over and streaked toward the lighted ball of the earth. He turned his head, looking over his shoulder at the mother ship. Tiny flashes of brilliant light speared from the starship. They lifted, fluttered, and followed him like a swarm of bees. They were giving chase. End of chapter 17. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas.
Chapter 18 of Sex Life of the Gods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. Sex Life of the Gods by Michael KNERR. Chapter 18. He had thought there would be a pursuit. He kicked at the rudder pedals and threw the stick. The scout ship rolled over and plunged toward the ice cap at the north pole of the planet. At 16,000 miles per hour, the rocket was little more than a guided missile, and he knew that when he reached the ice cap he'd have to throttle back, but then so would his pursuers. Beside him on the seat, Nick Danson's head rolled from side to side as the ship streaked toward the earth. The 4 scout ships were fanned out behind him and trying to close, yet he was holding them at bay with a mere 16,500 miles per hour. He wished frantically that he could have figured out a way to stymie the chase, but starships were not built to be sabotaged. The designers had done a damned good job on them, fitting them with every device known to prevent crippling or damaging by the enemy, whoever it may be. The 4 ships were hanging on him. "I've got to lose them," he thought feverishly. "I've got to lose them long enough to get Danson back to the cabin and get the hell out again. After that they can have me, but not now." He looked behind him, trying to determine whether or not they were getting set to fire on him. They didn't look it, but he couldn't tell. Weapons were not a scout ship's strong point. Each ship was armed with a large rocket launcher, but it was seldom used. Speed was the greatest weapon they needed, and the military designers of the home planet had poured all their energy into the fast maneuvering of the craft. The heavy caps of ice that covered the continent of Greenland loomed up before him, and he hoped that he could lose them in the white wilderness. He would have to throttle back when he reached the jagged waste of ice, but then so would the 4 behind him. They saw what he was attempting and poured all the power they could into their ships. Lors flattened the ship out in a shallow dive and pushed the throttle control until it stopped. The needle on the airspeed indicator leaped violently. 24,000 mph. The ice rose against the windshield swiftly. One of the scout ships closed and fired a rocket. He kicked at the rudder pedal and threw the ship to the left. The scout ship responded like a nervous horse and fluttered away as the rocket burned and arced beneath the underbelly. He pulled the throttle control back, cutting the speed of the ship and shoving on the rudder as he hauled at the stick. The maneuver was too fast for the ships behind him. They tore past him in silver flashes, trying to correct their error. He streaked off toward the Azores Islands, slicing into the atmosphere viciously, while he watched the other ships whirling off to come back at him. They would soon have to break radio silence, or they would never get him. It was almost impossible to close on a quarry at these speeds, unless each man knew what his buddy was doing. At 15,000 miles per hour, a microsecond of delay before acting could slam the 2 ships together with a violence that would atomize everything. Still they refused to make radio contact with each other. Lors watched them coming back at him, minute silver specks on the radar sweep. He shoved the stick forward and dived for the ocean in a shallow plunge. He had the biggest advantage in that they had to anticipate his moves in order to get him into their sights. One of them got him in his sights and fired. He watched the rocket spearing toward his ship and slammed the stick over to the right. The discus-like scout ship flipped over in a slow roll, the rocket barely missing the ship. Lors felt a little sick. He eased the throttle back, flattening the ship out not 50 feet above the water of the Atlantic Ocean. Then he shoved the throttle to the wall and raced north. The scout ship speed indicator swung crazily and stopped at 24,500 mph. Behind him, the other four were firewalling their throttles just to keep within range. They couldn't possibly fire at him because, going away at speeds like they were using, he could outrun any rocket made. Not only was that in his favor, but should one of them fire, they would fly into their own weapon. He glanced at Danson. Nick had awakened and was staring wide-eyed at the ocean that was spinning past them as they streaked north. Then Nick's mouth opened and Lors looked ahead. They were almost on the freighter. Lors lifted the ship and whipped over the spars of the ship in a rush that had probably broken lines and smashed windows all over the vessel. Behind him, the others were streaking over the ship, and Lors could imagine the terrified crew members, who had probably been knocked flat by the wash from the scout ships. Danson had fainted. Ahead of him was a heavy cloud cover. He streaked for it with his four buddies in hot pursuit. He hit the cloud cover and began dodging recklessly through it, changing his course constantly to throw his pursuers off. He burst out on the far side of the bank of clouds and couldn't see the other four ships. He streaked for the cabin in the mountain country of Pennsylvania, with Danson still out. Lors throttled back and hovered over the cabin. It was deserted. In the sunlight it looked like a child's toy house in a miniature clearing. He settled the ship in another small clearing in the woods beyond the house and shut off the engines. He threw back the canopy and removed the belt from around Danson. He slung the Terran over his shoulder and headed for the cabin. Still nothing moved about the place. Lors breathed a sigh of relief. All he had to do now was dump Danson and get out. Nick could tell his wife everything and get things straightened out. Bryce could be reported as missing in the woods, and the wrecked scout ship could be covered up by the men in Washington. He eased his way into the house and flopped Danson's unconscious body on the couch. He had started to pull off Danson's borrowed uniform when he heard the footstep. He whirled about. Beth! End of Chapter 18. Recording by Pamela Krantz.
Of Sex Life of the Gods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chuck Williamson. Sex Life of the Gods by Michael KNERR. Chapter 19. She stood there for a moment and stared at the two of them, and he could see from her face that she was not sure which one was her husband. Lors came to his feet and looked at her, not quite sure what to say or do. "Beth." "Don't explain, Lors," she told him. Her voice was as calm and unruffled as though she found men from outer space in the cabin every afternoon. "I brought him back," Lors began, and felt silly. He wondered vaguely how she had known about him and his being a spaceman. She came into the room and up to where he stood, her eyes boring into his. "Why did you bring him back? You could have come back by yourself and continued the whole thing." The realization of her words dawned upon him slowly, and he blinked. "You know about me? How?" "I'll tell you later. Why did you bring him back?" "You want him, don't you? It couldn't work out. Any fool can see that." He reached out and gripped her shoulders firmly. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way, Beth. It was all supposed to go like clockwork. We never figured on the scout ship being wrecked, and I never figured on falling in love with you." "That's why you brought him back? Because you love me?" He nodded, trying vainly to brush aside the trembling emotion that lifted within him at the touch of her flesh. It was a weird feeling. "I thought about taking his place, Beth. I thought about it, but I knew it wouldn't work. It was a half-crazy thing in the beginning. I'm sorry." A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Don't be. I'm not the least bit sorry, but I'm glad I know the truth. Now it doesn't seem so ridiculous. Bryce disappearing into thin air. She looked about the room. Where is he? Dead. Dead. Her eyes widened. Lors nodded. I brought your husband back against my commander's orders. When I tried to get Bryce out of the hospital, he went berserk and began shooting things up. One of the spacers killed him. Poor Nolan, she whispered, and he could see tears welling up in her eyes. Then she looked at him sharply. You acted against orders? He nodded again. What will happen to you? Nothing. It's all come out all right. But, Beth, how did you know? Who told you about this? I did. Lors whirled around, his eyes swinging against those of the husky blonde in the dress suit who stood in the doorway of the cabin. Automatically, his hand dropped toward the pistol at his side, but the blonde stopped him. Don't bother with that, Lors, he grinned. I'm not about to draw. Who are you? Lors demanded. Here I'm Cartwell, of the Secret Service, but actually I'm New Spacer Nesso of the 6th Terran Command. You told her? Lors asked, amazed. The blonde nodded. I had to. I came here to check on Bryce and found her ready to call the police. Because first Nolan had disappeared, and then you had. I had to think of something to keep her quiet, and the only thing I could think of was the truth. I'm a lousy agent, he added, grinning. Lors nodded and bit his lower lip. How do things stand now? He asked. Not too bad, Cartwright told him. I've made arrangements to have the wrecked ship hauled out of the area for study. This will be hush-hush for a while, then left to dissolve for itself. Everyone will forget it. What about Bryce? Cartwell pursed his lips. That was a rough break, but unavoidable. We can cover up by saying that he was searching the wooded area with the rescue squads and apparently became lost. After searching and finding nothing, we can let the people draw their own conclusions. Risky, Lors told him. It'll work, unless you have a better idea? Lors shook his head. You can handle things down here, Cartwell. I have my own problems up there. He pointed at the ceiling to indicate the starship. And I'd better get Danson's uniform off and move. Beth caught his arm. Let me keep it, Lors. It won't go into the wrong hands, I promise. Lors looked at Cartwell, who nodded. Let them have it, he said. They're on our side anyhow. All right. He paused. I'll be going. Beth linked her arm in his. I'd like to walk to the ship with you. I'd like that. He grinned at Cartwell and led her outside into the afternoon sunlight. They didn't speak until they reached the small clearing where the scout ship waited for them. Then Beth pulled his head down and kissed him. Goodbye, Lors, she whispered. I'll come back. One of these days both our people will be friends, and we'll meet again. I hope so. He glanced up at the sky and saw two of the scout ships flashing about, high above the clouds. My escort, he told her, grinning. You'll have trouble. He kissed her lightly on the mouth. No, I'll marry the commander's daughter, and it'll be okay. Is she beautiful? Yes. He caught the sudden flash of womanly hurt rise in her eyes, and smiled. Almost as beautiful as you. He kissed her lightly again, and leaped to the cockpit of the scout ship. He motioned her away from the blast area, and eased the ship up above the trees. She waved to him, and looked very small among the trees. He lifted a hand to her, then swung the ship upward, slamming the throttle forward to head back to the starship. And Jella. The end. End of chapter 19. End of The Sex Life of the Gods by Michael KNERR.